I'd like us to think about, again, the broad topic of child flourishing, but also the interdisciplinarity of the question, that we need to help each other kind of find the ways to look at it, find ways to study it, promote it, depending on what we're working on. And so I thought I'd ask the speakers if you had any reactions to each other's talks within the topic area, or suggestions even, or general questions for the group. And I encourage the audience also to come up with questions or comments about these things. Those things will work once you start talking.
I was really struck by the rich variation in methodologies, with the diary methodology and the ethnographic interviews and behavioral measures and observational measures. And I think there is such richness in the use of a variety of measures to really try to better understand the stories of children and families. So I just found that very interesting, particularly hearing from our anthropologist. I'm not typically, I don't typically interact with anthropologists, and that's probably a flaw, because it was just fascinating, really, so rich.
I was just going to say thank you, but I also appreciated seeing all the different methodologies as well. I think that there's a lot that the social sciences can learn from each other, and there was also plenty of common language, I felt like, too. So.
In terms of the methodologies, I'm always a little envious of the ability to get kind of intense dyad, because as Hillary mentioned with her research, she's thousands of hours, right, in the community. So you imagine how much intense fieldwork time it takes to get that many hours of data. And I know it's not any easier in psych. You have to recruit people, you have to get them to come in and take time out of their day and watch them. But I always find that to be some of the more challenging data to get, because in anthropology, always trying to not be what is seen as invasive. And you are, right? Like, you're there and you don't live there, and everyone knows you're there collecting data. But to try to get some of that nuanced kind of dyad data about, how is a parent responding to a child's stressful moment? Are they, giving them, warm cuddles? Are they speaking to them? How is the child then responding? Like, that kind of level of intensity is something that I wish I had in my data set. Yeah.
I guess I'll just add in addition, I think, to the methodological differences, I think that how people have been approaching some of the same, not necessarily the same questions, but some of the same constructs in very different ways, I think we're finding some very interesting patterns. And, parenting obviously has come up as one of the big factors, but it's interesting to think about looking at the parent's brain and what's happening there, looking at mind-mindedness. So what are the parents thinking about? How are they interpreting behaviors, looking at overt behaviors? And then some of the things Mark Cummings was talking about, where sometimes children don't even have to see the behavior, that they just sense that, there's something's been resolved or that sort of thing. So it's really kind of cool to see how you can come in at all these different angles and, still find some patterns there, regardless of how you look at things.
If I could ask a sort of slightly overarching question, it's something that I've been thinking about over the years, and it's a methodological controlled concern, which is that in many of these studies, there's no account of whether or not the primary attachment figure and the child are actually spending very much time together at all. Because quite frequently, these children, these young babies, toddlers, and small children are actually not in the care of the mothers. The mothers may not have a very good understanding of who their child is. And yet there seems to be no, when we're looking at some very fine detail of the interaction between parents and children, there seems to be no account of the duration of non-parental care. I'm not really talking about alloparents in the classic fathers or grandparents or whatever. I'm talking about the care of strangers or institutional care of daycare, not orphanage care. And it's just a variable that seems to be so significant as to the quality of the time not spent with the people with whom the measurements are being made. I just wonder if anybody got any thoughts about this?
I can just say, we had some data, we published this in the late 90s, where we asked, it's not a great measure, but we asked sort of the number of work hours mothers and fathers were spending, and work hours didn't seem to impact fathers' attachment with children, but mothers' work hours impacted infants' attachment with fathers. And what we suspected, we don't have any data to support this, negatively. So women who were working more than 20 hours a week out of the home had children who were more likely to be insecure with fathers, which at first puzzled us. But what I wish we had was data in the home where when mother's coming home from work, who's more likely to take care of the baby, right? Probably the mother. And father can be helping out with the other siblings and things like that, but now this is her time to spend time. So it wasn't impacting her security, or the infant's security with her, but it was interesting that it was indirectly or directly impacting the attachment with the father. Now, like I said, it was a crude measure because all we had were work hours. We didn't know what else was going on. But it's really interesting to think about quantity of time in addition to quality of time.
I can say a word to that too. So the samples I work with, my guess would be from talking to the women that very, very few really low-income women use daycare. I don't think many of them are not working at all and stay home full-time. But what has come up in one study we did on social networks was that the presence of other, especially nonviolent male caregivers who were living in the home had positive effects on children's adjustment after exposure to violence. So, having the involvement of another primary caregiver, even if mother was home all the time, was still of benefit.
Another thing that we talked about earlier in the conference was the impact of screen technology. So I suppose we're not really measuring how much, even if parents are with the child, how much they're spending giving attention to the child rather than to a phone or some other screen. Is that correct, Laura? You don't have a measure of that, perhaps?
I actually am collecting data on that in my but I haven't looked at it yet. I think that's a really interesting question. So we're collecting information in this study on how much screen time kids spend on weekends and on weekdays on computer, TV, and smartphone or other kind of handheld technology. And then the balance of what they do on that, whether it's educational or entertainment, and if the entertainment has violent content or not. But yeah, none of that. I haven't looked at any of that yet.
Someone told me recently about his visit to Vietnam some years ago, and he noticed how calm everybody was. And then he noticed that pretty much all babies were held all the time. And when he was in a restaurant, he saw an Australian family come into a restaurant, and immediately several waiters came over and one of them took the baby and said, well, you'll be busy eating now, so I'll walk around with the baby. So they don't put the baby down, it's like arms to arms to arms to arms. And it seems to me that's going to be related to a kind of a peaceful nature, which I know Laura is a part of the Kroc Peace Institute as a faculty member. And so I was just wondering, we're not measuring that kind of thing, how long the baby's in arms or a child is touching a parent, right? At least typically.
Yeah, we had information on that, not in the U.S. I don't know if I didn't speak up because I sort of feel like we have sort of the opposite issue. So I think a lot of the anthropologists studying children have these long, everyday, daily experience observations, but we don't necessarily have measures of attachment, or we don't have some of the more micro analysis of behavior that you can get in a lab setting. But you know, I do think that it is possible to follow infants and children in their homes, and I think that it doesn't have to necessarily be as for 12 hours. But I do think, though, that there is something missed when we don't, when we can't actually get hard scores of touch and holding in particular, because I think that it's really easy to focus, it's not easy, but there's a tendency to focus on quality of interactions and less so on quantity of interactions. And I think that that's a bias sort of, I think it's a bias in the way that Americans and American researchers think about it, and I think it's evident in the design of research to focus on the shortest possible observation you can get, as long as you can get the quality that you're looking for. And I think that there's something lost when we don't look at quantity of time, which involves some of these quieter behaviors that take more time to observe, like touch, because I think that that touching during interaction is one thing, but how often is that child in physical contact during the day and the multitude of different people? And I think that the only way to really get that is to be in the field and follow babies around. And I think that less and less, and that's hard to do in the US because not everyone wants you in their home, but I do think it's not impossible to get a little bit more of these authentic daily experiences. I know financially it's different, you know, it's difficult. It's when in a lab you can get sort of everything accomplished in the visits or series of visits. But I do think that there is something to be said for understanding quantity time in parenting.
I was just going to add that one of the reasons why I noted that Jamaica was a particularly pronatal environment is that we talk a lot about how screen time impacts parental kind of investment on a kind of moment-to-moment level, but also the way in which our culture structures itself so that there are fewer spaces where parents can be holding babies in public also kind of impacts attachment. And so that you have restaurants that don't allow babies. And so I have a friend who's actually a faculty member in Indonesia. He had the same comment about the waiters coming and taking their 2-year-old and walking around the restaurant and entertaining the 2-year-old while he and his wife eat. And, you know, that's just completely unthinkable. In the United States, you would never expect that to happen. So you have places where it is explicitly not okay to bring babies, and in Jamaica, that's just not the case. And so women are going about their day-to-day lives all the time with babies in their arms, maybe in a stroller, but that's less common, you know, but constantly having a baby so that, like, one-on-one contact is happening all the time. But it's not just a parental child kind of negotiation and choice, it's also the context in which that parent is parenting and whether the community is accepting of a child being, you know, in that space.
I want to piggyback on what Robin's saying here too, because thinking about these spaces where children are allowed or children are commonly seen or commonly accepted. And I think that if we look at the child development literature in the US, where we do have really good longer observations is in those spaces where children that are made for children. So in infant toddler care, in preschool care, and in schools. But we just have fewer and less depictions of those other spheres that are more that children sort of have partial or temporary access to, and homes tend to be in the US more private places too, so it's hard to observe there. So I think there are some cultural barriers to doing that kind of work in the US, not ones that cannot be overcome, but I do think it's more difficult.
It's important to remember that these practices like touch are affecting the neurobiological development of the vagus nerve, for example, which relates to all systems of the body. You can have seizures if it's not set properly, or irritable bowel syndrome, or cardio problems, because it runs throughout the body.
And it's not just close proximity to children, it's that actual touch, because more and more we're seeing out in public children being carried around in the little portable car seats. I don't know, I always call them bucket sort of seats, but rather than in arms, and even some of the soft carriers promote touch, but there's a lot of being near and close and available for interaction with children that actually puts barriers to touch in between the caregiver and the child. And I think that I don't think we understand in the U.S. the impact at all of this shift that's been going on for the last couple of decades.
And now we prevent teachers from hugging children, too. But then, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, they've done studies with the still face paradigm where during the still face, if you allow the mother to touch the baby, the still face effect is greatly reduced. Mother still is flat affect, but the touch is obviously very important.
And there is one study I know of that looked at, proximity was held constant because some mothers had the plastic carriers, and I can't recall the author right now, and the other mothers had a soft carrier that they held the baby in the body, and they found that with touch increase, it also related to higher sensitivity and responses to the infant emotions, even though both infants in both groups were right near the mother all the time. It was the difference between the touch that the mother seemed to be more sensitized and responsive to the infant emotions. But
Well, earlier this year, there was a study that actually came out showing that it was in Australia, and it was increased use of strollers. It was actually altering brain development in kids. And I believe it was total myelination. I'll tweet it out with the hashtag. But it was something like a 30% reduction in contact time among stroller-using parents.
I can look that up. I just don't remember off the top of my head.
Well, here I am. There's two quite good studies on physical contact and social-emotional outcomes. Anisfeld, 1990, Columbia University. Does infant caring promote attachment? Anyone heard of that study? Okay, well, yes, it was a quite high-risk group of inner-city mothers, as they called them. And one group was given a car seat, the other group was given soft-structured carriers. And 1 year later, via the strange situation, 83% were securely attached in the carrier group, and 38% were securely attached in the control group, the bucket, the car seat group. So it's an absolutely outlier in terms of attachment intervention. So that's one of the studies. It was never replicated, which is a little sad, but yeah.
That was the one I was talking about, and I left out the part about the attachment measure. I was remembering the part about the sensitivity, but thank you. That was the one I was referring to, because that's the only one I know of at all.
Well, there is another recent one from Bigelov and Powers up in Nova Scotia, where they suggested to middle-class, relatively low-risk mothers that they should have exposed themselves to skin-to-skin contact in the first month after birth. Obviously, the first question was, were the mothers ready to do it? And they found that, okay, and the control group, they basically said nothing. They just didn't say anything about skin-to-skin contact. And the mothers that were instructed or suggested to them that they have skin-to-skin contact, they did it for about 6 hours per day the first week. And then week 2 to 4, they had it for about 3 hours a day. So there was fairly good compliance in that sense. They looked at the incidence of depression, and well, this was a relatively low-risk group. The control group, 10% scored above the threshold on the EDPDS, Edinburgh Depression Scale, and 5% in the contact group. So actually, reduction was about 50%. 1 month later, this difference was not significant, but there were fewer in the group that had physical contact. So depression seemed to be affected just by exposure to the physical contact, the skin-to-skin contact. They looked at breastfeeding outcomes, and for some reason, Canada, 70% of the mothers in both groups initiated breastfeeding when they had left the hospital. The control group, about 30% had given up by 3 months breastfeeding. The skin-to-skin group, virtually all the mothers were still breastfeeding, which is quite outstanding. Then they looked at the children, and already at 1 week, they looked at the amount of time that children were able to stay in the quiet alert state. And when the skin-to-skin children could stay much longer in the quiet alert, which they speculated that probably could influence how much is this child taking in the world? And lo and behold, they did the still phase situation at 1, 2, and 3 months. And already at 1 month, the skin children reacted to the mother's still phase, whereas the control group did not. So the authors are saying, seems already by 1 month, these skin children are beginning to have expectations. How should the mother behave? And when she doesn't communicate, well, that's a violation of what they expected. 2 months, the curves was kind of similar, a dip when the mother in positive vocalizations, both the groups of children reacted. At 3 months, the skin-to-skin group reacted with an increase in positive vocalizations during the still phase, which is, according to Bigelow, a behavior you'd expect at around 7 months normally in infants. So this whole thing with physical contact and skin-to-skin contact, also in the light of the recent oxytocin studies, I think, I come to all the attachment conferences or many of the depression conferences, and this, it's a huge confounder how much physical contact the parents engage in with the child, and it's not even being accounted for. And perhaps I think psychologists, when all you have is a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail, so you're very much into sort of neocortical type of constructs of mindedness and so on, which I do have respect for. But I'm hoping with the works of Ruth Feldman and other people on oxytocin that we start to have a more biological model for, and at least include that in terms of how do also the parenting develop. Somebody stop me if I get too long-winded, but just one more comment, which is Ruth Feldman, again, who's a colleague of James. She did a study on looking at mothers' maternal representations, and she categorized mothers' way of looking at a child or engaging with a child in a sort of primary preoccupation. Is my child fed? Is it secure? Is it living? Is it breathing? A dry diaper? And the other way of looking at it was these attachment-related thoughts. And she looked at it as a function of how much exposure did the mothers have to their children. And she couldn't really randomize them, but she looked at mothers who had very premature birth and the children were separated, so very little exposure to the infant, and a medium group where the mothers had relatively late preterm births, but the mothers could have contact with the child during the day, but had to leave the child during the night. And the last group, full contact and full-term births. And well, the mothers that had full exposure to the infant, the balance between their worry, probably linked to cortisol, and the attachment thoughts, they were quite well balanced. So overall, it was more or less rewarding to be a mother. At the moment the separation occurred with a sort of medium separation nightly, the worrisome thoughts took over and you had less of the attachment thoughts. And then, of course, with the very first group, well, both systems actually went down in self-defense for the mother. And as Ruth Feldman puts it, with some of the mothers, we measured their way of thinking of the child from these very preterm children after they had gotten out of the hospital. The child is alive, it's doing well, it's healthy. But these mothers were still very reduced in their engagement with the child. So it says these effects are not very easily reversible. So yes, contact seems to do something to the child in so many domains. And Feldman's 10-year follow-up, or kangaroo mother care, 10-year follow-up, cardiac vagal tone, executive function, which we all like, sleep organization, basal stress regulation. 10 years later, she sees effects, significant effects. So yes, for the child, certainly something happens, but looking also at mothers as having not a sort of a default caregiving hormonal setup, but having very different, when they enter into pregnancy and into motherhood, having different systems that are not necessarily that working all that optimally, and see if the exposure to the infant, if that can help stimulate those hormonal networks. That's a slightly different model than what we have worked with in the past within the fields of psychology and depression. And thank you for your patience. Okay.
All of those who have cited a study, could you please tweet it at our hashtag here, Child Flourishing, and please do be tweeting. Thank you for those who couldn't make it. Do we have reaction from the panel at all? I wanted to ask EA if you had any thoughts about the other studies and how looking at breastfeeding or effects might add to their work?
There was actually a study that came out while I was in the field, so last summer, 2013, that actually looked at white versus gray matter in breastfed versus not breastfed infants. The citation is Sean Dioni. I don't remember the journal, but it's DEONI. And he had some phenomenal stuff actually showing greater neurological development, or I guess really decelerated neurological development in formula-fed infants. I fell into the old trap of comparing bottle feeding as if it's the norm, when really it's delayed neurological development, because breastfed neurological development would be the standard. But I wonder how, and he did not suggest it was anything in milk perhaps, I wonder how much of it is is that skin-to-skin contact, because this was kind of a conversation we were having at lunch, is how little time an infant that's receiving formula may actually ever be in skin-to-skin contact with a mother. And even, pheromones, things that are exchanged via that, mouth to nipple for that's essentially what it is. And even just skin to skin, you may prop a bottle, you may, I show my growth and development class an image of one of those bottle hangers on the car seats. You don't even have to touch your kid to feed them. When we talk about these issues of feeding and attachment. So, we don't know if it's the milk. We don't know if it's the skin. We don't know if it, it could even be something like the fatty acids in milk. There's a large literature coming out of Lassick and Gallen's group now looking at DHA and brain development and arguing that may be contributing to some of this development.
This wonderful conference has been concentrating on thank you, has been concentrating quite rightly on contact between mother and baby, or whoever is looking after the baby. We haven't actually heard anything, I suddenly realize, about talking to babies and how important that is, and how Richard very nicely tells a story about himself with me carrying a very new baby, nattering the whole time, and him thinking, for goodness sake, he doesn't understand a single word, why does she bother? And only later realizing you have to start with a baby who doesn't understand, otherwise they never will understand. And we do all agree that it's important to talk to children, don't we?
I do agree it's important to talk to children, but just to problematize it a little bit, and not in all cultures is talking to children valued, prescribed, or what's done. So I would say that it's really easy to sort of idealize, the foragers, the Aka and the Bofi that I looked at, but talking to babies is not a common thing, actually. I did put some of the data up there with even the older children, and these are very, very low frequencies of talking directly to the child. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not in an environment in which there is lots of talking going on around them and other people, but it isn't this, there's very little of this, put the baby in front of you and talk all day. There's much more, I actually think it's much more looks like parent-centered parenting, not baby-centered parenting. Babies go along with parents everywhere and are taken along and incorporated into the work and incorporated into the community, but nothing stops to give the baby extra attention. They're soothed as the mother's working, a pat here or a pat there, or a kiss or a cuddle, but and I know that talking is very important in terms of baby's development, at least in Western cultures, but I don't think we should overemphasize it, because I think that it's depending on what outcomes you're looking for and what we're talking about here, because at least among foragers, who often sort of are idealized as this model of parenting, there just isn't a lot of talking to babies, although there is a lot of talking around babies because they're in these rich community contexts. And I'm not disagreeing with you, but I just think I think it's something that can be problematic in assuming that that's very common. Sorry.
The particular study was done by Sally Ward, and it hit the headlines in England because she had done a simple piece of work where she took at-risk children and mothers, and she got them to the one group they were a matched sample of about 50, and one group were asked for the vocabulary and the development of the education of their child. That's how it was placed. To get on the floor, turn off the radio, turn off the TV, and they were given a little hour lesson in baby talk as to how to communicate with their babies from 3 to 6 months. And the finding was the 7-year follow-up was a 13-point IQ advantage for the group who was talked to than the group who weren't, or weren't given that instruction. And when I contacted her, I said, well, how would that work out in terms of the mother's attachment to the baby, and on the baby's attachment to the mother? And bless her, she said, I knew you'd ask that question. Of course, at the time, I didn't know, so I didn't do any attachment measures. But anecdotally, it was profound. And I know Howard Steele has tried to follow up that cohort to see how they were getting on later. But it was the phenomenal advance in vocabulary, and of course, my way of thinking, an opportunity to discover your baby and connect to them with this floor time, face-to-face baby talk.
And I completely agree that the evidence that talking to babies is extremely important from studies in the US and Europe. And I'm not saying it is or isn't or shouldn't be important among non-Western groups, but I'm just saying that it generally isn't something that parents there do much of. And I don't know that there's a problem with attachment related to it there, because there's a tremendous emphasis on close physical proximity and responses to emotions, but there's not that same level of talking. And I am absolutely not trying to say that we shouldn't promote parents talking to children. I mean, when I was my husband would often joke when I was at home on maternity leave when my son was a baby that, and I was by myself most of the time, and I am a talker, and I talk to him constantly, and he was often laughing at why I was talking. I mean, because I understand the importance of it, but I just wonder if it is an important element in terms of the expectations and goals, in terms of what we're looking for in terms of academic as well as social emotional development among children, specifically in contexts like North America and Europe, or is it crucial to attachment? Are there other pathways in which babies can form healthy attachments? Because if it is crucial, then a large population of the world, including most hunter-gatherers, would be considered to be not on a healthy pathway to attachment if talking to baby face-to-face is the linchpin, is what I'm trying to say.
This was a high-risk group.
Right.
Intervention.
Right. Oh, and I agree with those results completely. I'm just
Can I
problematizing it a little
I want
bit.
to add something to
Yeah.
that. I think what's interesting to think about is not maybe talking versus not talking, but if you're not talking to your baby, what are you doing?
Yes.
So they're getting exposed to all sorts of other interactions and activities as opposed to the baby who's propped up in front of the TV
Exactly.
or ignored and neglected. So,
Right.
totally different scenario.
Because I think it's more, I guess in terms of the talking versus not talking, I feel like it's what I would guess would be most important is being in a socially rich environment, whether it's the version of face-to-face talking or whether it's other community sort of, but socially rich, but not necessarily that it has to be the baby at the center of the conversation to meet whatever it is that needs to be met in terms of the development.
They are running to pick up the baby, though, right? So the baby's
They are.
communicating a need.
Oh, absolutely.
And so there is a back and forth
Yes.
reciprocal responsiveness that may not be talking to them, but
Right.
certainly responding.
This issue connects with the issue that was raised earlier about how there is this vicious cycle between our Euro-American unexamined belief system and the way it informs the way we do our research, and then all of the structural issues that get built around the way we do our research that then reinforce it. So in the area of language development, I think Pat Kuhl's lab at University of Washington is one of the foremost groups in looking at this very early on. Anne Fernald at Stanford is another. And I've asked both of them this question about, in non-nuclear families, which is how most of the world has raised its children for most of history, what do we know about how exposure to the wider range of caregivers and the language that is going on around them contributes to early language development? And they have told me they haven't looked at it for all of the reasons that we just discussed. It's a whole lot easier when we are working with our linear causal models to look at the, quote, dyad and to make the assumption that that is the meaningful unit, and to look at short snippets of time than to look at complex systems of families that are constituted differently. And then the other thing that I want to add to this discussion is that in the US now there is enormous focus on early language development and early literacy, and I'm afraid that some of it is being misguided or misunderstood by a kind of monolithic understanding of poverty. And I think that we, again, in our approach to science, we're sort of pushed to make generalizations about groups. And I think we all know that that is also how racism advances, is by making generalizations about groups. So that when we talk about poverty, as I think we've done during this conference, we have to take great care to scratch the surface to look at the subgroups or the intragroup differences within people who might all be described as people living in poverty, and to look, for example, at things like positive deviance. But in this intense focus on language development in the US, there's this assumption that we have this product-oriented interest in early development, which is basically to arrive at a globally competitive workforce in a world in which language-based skills are the ones that are most highly valued. So I think we have to step back and look at that thrust when we then ask, well, what is going on in some of the places that Professor Fouts, is that how you say it? Has looked at, where there's a whole different project, I would guess, for where you are going with your children.
I think it's important to also emphasize that we're always talking about economic poverty when we talk about poverty, rather than the relational poverty that Bruce Perry was pointing out that we've subjected our kids to, even in the upper and middle classes in this country.
I really appreciate how much interdisciplinary talk is going on here, and I wanted to throw something else into the mix here, and that's looking at it from the parent's perspective and looking at the experience of birth and how much that has changed in recent years, and what a huge impact that has, especially on women's experiences as becoming mothers, and everything about their biology and their emotions. And I wanted to mention that, in case you don't know about it, there's an organization called the Coalition for Improving Maternity, I can't remember what the last, services. And there's a lot of research-based evidence that they've collected about how harmful the overly medical model is, and how to make our experiences here in the US more mother-baby friendly. And just throwing it out there because I think it's a really important factor, and it may be something that you are able to look at, what that experience was for that mother. And I think it was Ina May Gasky, who said that the mother's experience at birth can be either empowering or disempowering, and that it is a very significant experience for most mothers.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have also been really excited to hear all the pathways to child flourishing. I think we're missing an important F word, and that's fun. I don't know about you all, but I attach so easily to people that I can have fun with, that I can laugh with. And I'm not saying any of what we've talked about is not important. Of course it's important. But sometimes we get inside these things and they're so serious and they're so intense and we're so convinced that we have something that can help moms and babies and families, and we really do leave out that big F word of fun. And especially when you see now research coming out and showing things like laughter yoga and getting endorphins from doing things that help you laugh and relax you and you can enjoy with others. So I would just say there's another pathway to flourishing for families in general, and that would be fun and laughter together.
Yeah, I actually wanted to add, part of the reason why I showed you the shots of the playgrounds and things like that is that for the kids that are not living with their family, some of that social time is some of the more important and only relaxed time they have in the day is you know, and especially because some of these kids, because of early life trauma, are really struggling in school. And so lots of the directors of the homes mentioned to me that they're working to find more tutors to help these kids catch up. So school is not a place of kind of leisure and fun for these kids. For a lot of them, they're already outliers because they're not getting to go home to a family at the end of the day, and the kids at school know that, and the kids themselves told me that school can be challenging. And so it was kind of important for me to take note of what kids did with their leisure time and what things were available to them. And I realized just now as you were saying this is that I showed you the really nice facility and I told you that the dorms were padlocked in 2013. So was the nice playground. And I don't know if it was having upkeep, and that routine upkeep was then cost prohibitive, right? Because playground structures break down. I'm not entirely sure what happened with the funding revenue or the stream that they were dealing with, but these very basic things that kids need to thrive, the kids were really struggling with. And I take your point that, you know, play is essential.
Getting back to the talking with your baby, I think there's talking with the baby. The baby is teaching the parent how to non-verbally communicate. And non-verbally communicating includes words and their emotional tone and the attention between the two that is occurring as the parent is speaking and the baby is listening more deeply than the parent understands. So there's a two-way flow there that in this culture speaking can really help with.
Thank you all very much for sticking around for the conversation, and thank you so much, speakers, today. Wonderful day.